let's talk about British Islamic State fighters in Syria, which we haven't done for quite a long time. Well, we're going to do so today because, according to Donald Trump's incoming counter-terrorism chief, the UK should repatriate British members of Islamic State being held in Syrian prisoner camps. Sebastian Gorka, a regular on the station, says the British American appointed as Deputy Assistant to the President-elect said Sir Keir Starmer's government should honour what he called the commitment to the international fight against ISIS by bringing home dozens of its citizens languishing in northeast Syria. Now, there are around 20 British women, 40 children and 10 men who are understood to be among them. The prisoners include Shamima Begum, who left for Syria from Bethnal Green, East London, as a schoolgirl and lost a final appeal last year against the government's rescinding of her British citizenship. Mr. Gorka said any nation which wishes to be seen to be a serious ally and friend of the most powerful nation in the world should act in a fashion that reflects that serious commitment. Now, he says that's doubly so for the UK, which has a very special place in President Trump's heart, and we would all wish to see the special relationship fully re-established. Well, some fairly strong words there from Mr. Gorka. I wonder, I think this is in a sense a heart versus head thing, because I doubt whether there are many people listening to this programme tonight who would like to see any Islamic State people coming back to this country. I certainly don't want them here. However, under international law, they are British citizens and they hold British passports, and therefore they are a responsibility of Britain. So the argument goes, well, bring them back here, obviously don't release them on the streets, and throw the book at them. Send them through the British justice system, and there'll be various offences that they can be charged with, and then they can spend a very, very long time in a British prison. Do you think that's what we should do? I recognise that there'll be a lot of emotions in this, where people say, we can't possibly have terrorist sympathisers back in this country, even in prison. Well, Britain's independent reviewer of terrorism legislation, Jonathan Hall, KC, was taking your calls on LBC this afternoon and was asked about these demands to repatriate British jihadis.
The idea of landing a lot of hardened male jihadis with fighting experience, some of them would be deeply traumatised by the violence that they may have either suffered or engaged in, would be a very big ask at a time when the authorities also dealing with major state threats. So I think pragmatically, I would say children and women, I would find it very hard about the men, I have to admit.
Well, Major-General Chip Chapman joins me now, former Head of Counter Terrorism at the Ministry of Defence. Major-General, thank you very much for joining us. What's your view on this? Are there two sides to this story, or does the legal obligation trump everything else?
I don't think that the legal obligation trumps everything else, and there's been a reluctance really for four reasons. The legal one is actually because the evidence gathering challenge is such that there's probably an unlikelihood of gaining a prosecution for them in evidential terms, and the burden of getting that evidence. That is why, if you did bring them back, they could be looked at under different legislation. So, for example, the Counter-Terrorism and Sentencing Bill of 2019, which came in after the fall of IS at Baghouz, which was in March 2019, lowered the standard, for example, for TPIMs, that's the Terrorism Prevention Implementation Measures, where if with the fact that you might not have the evidence, you can keep people under a regime where they're absolutely surveilled 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, and it extended that indefinitely with a 2-year review period. So the legal one is more complex than people think. The second reason why there's been a reluctance is because of the domestic political risk. Doing nothing is better than doing something. And the last thing you want is sort of terrorist recidivism. Although these people under that TPIM regime would go through potentially a desistance and disengagement program, there have been people who've done that, who've gained the system and then done terrorist attacks. And the classic example is Usman Khan after the 2019 London Bridge attack. There are some who are just ideologically bulletproof and can game the system. The third thing is because the surveillance regime and the TPIMs is actually economically quite difficult, and it's a lot of people are required to do that. And the fourth one is because people can game the system, that security risk is something you don't want. And of course, the new government's been under a lot of pressure anyway, and the last thing it wants is to bring people back again and for something to go wrong where they'll be blamed. So those are the reasons of the reluctance. Of course, there's potentially a moral issue of bringing women and children back. I don't know if those figures would be totally accurate that you mentioned, because certainly of those who went initially, and there were 900 in total who went to Syria and Iraq, 150 of those were dual nationals and therefore lost their citizenship. And, for example, we could do that with Shamima Begum under a thing called jus sanguinis, which is inheritance through the bloodline because of her Bangladeshi sort of roots. So, I'm not sure how many of those have had that done to. So, for example, there were a number of other people who were in the pipeline for the Special Immigration Appeals Court, which was the route that Shamima Begum took. Now, there have been countries who've taken a very robust approach to this and have actually brought all their people back. And rather surprisingly, most of them were in the sort of stand. So Russia, Kosovo, Uzbekistan, Tajikistan, Kazakhstan, they did take all their radicalized people back. And we've been very reluctant to do so. And there's bad political or good political reasons why we don't want to do that. And no repatriation has been the policy line.
Sebastian Gorka is effectively saying, if you don't do this, the special relationship will not continue. Now, does that play any part in the decision that Keir Starmer is going to have to make on this, do you think?
Well, I think we've seen across a range of issues this muscular transactionalism of Trump. But this is actually Trump 2.0 repeating Trump 1.0. So in 2019, when Theresa May was Prime Minister, he then said to Europe, after the fall of Baghouz and the Islamic State, take back the 800 who were then the number of people in Europe, or the alternative would be to release them. Now, the new dynamic here is that the partner of choice in Syria, the Syrian Democratic Force, is under pressure from the SNA, the Syrian National Army sponsored by Turkey, and therefore may not have the resources long term to guard the people who are in these prisons. And one of the strategic things for IS in that region has always been prison breaks. But there's a lose-lose situation here, because what you also don't want is another Camp Bucca. And of course, it was people like Baghdadi who were radicalized in Camp Bucca. And the fact if you keep people in indefinitely or near indefinitely in these places does potentially produce this radicalization and a ticking time bomb for the future. It's precarious suspension is the phrase generally used about this.
Thank you very much indeed. That's Major-General Chip Chapman, former Head of Counter Terrorism at the Ministry of Defence. Mesa Gifford joins me now, human rights activist who left his job in the City of London to fight with Kurdish forces against ISIS in Syria. Now, Mesa, I can't remember how long ago it was that you and I spent an hour in the studio taking calls from listeners on this, but I do remember that it was a very memorable hour. Just before I ask you about this, what's happened to you since?
Well, plenty. Obviously, one of the most obvious things in regards to Syria was I wrote a book. But in more recent years, I actually went out to Ukraine to fight against Russia alongside the Ukrainian military. So I was there for 2 years alongside the 131st Separate Reconnaissance Battalion, fighting in the south in and around a place called Kherson, finishing my time in the east of the country, only returning at the beginning of the year for sort of family reasons.
So, on this question of repatriating British ISIS fighters, what's your view?
Well, I personally think it would be appalling to rescue these people from Syria before they've spent their day in court there. They've broken two sets of laws here, our own in the UK for going off and joining a terrorist organisation, but also, more importantly, they've gone to a country that is very diverse, very beautiful. In the eastern part of the country, the British and American government supports the SDF, the Syrian Democratic Forces. They are the ones holding these people. This organisation, this group, is a a secular and democratic group, as I said, supported by the West, the coalition. They were the ones that led the charge against the Islamic State. And they're the ones that have called in the past for a sort of truth and reconciliation process, a process where they can also start trying ISIS prisoners and jailing them for their crimes. I would hope to see something of that nature come into force and get support in the West.
And the judicial system that they have, is it one that could command international respect?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, this region, as I said, liberated itself from ISIS, and then in the years afterwards, started putting together a progressive, secular democracy. They've struggled. Obviously, Syria is a country blighted by civil war. They've tried to do things by international norms. They've opened consuls around the world in places like Moscow and in Washington, D.C. And as I said before, they are the Americans and Britain's partners of choice in Syria. Now, if there's anyone in Syria that can hold our confidence in holding these people to account, I think it's people like the SDF. We've got to give local people agency. We mustn't ignore them in this process. There are something like 70,000 ISIS prisoners in these camps. The local people do not have the resources at the moment to try them all and to imprison them effectively. If we actually rallied behind local people, gave them the support, diplomatic, economic, etc., that they need and require, then I think we can actually come out of this with a much better solution than just simply bringing them back to the UK, where we will struggle to sort of punish them effectively, and where we'll just increasingly strain MI5 and the security services with potentially dozens of former British citizens, but more importantly, thousands of other prisoners that could also be released and find their way into Europe. So it's, I think the process, should start in Syria and not at home with us.
But why hasn't it already started? I mean, these people have been in these camps for several years. Why haven't they been tried already?
Political naivety. They've kicked it under the carpet. I mean, after the Islamic State, there was a sense of urgency in defeating them. I was there in Raqqa in 2017 when the city fell. I watched the remnants of the Islamic State sort of creep out of the city. We allowed them to leave. A deal was done where we were fighting in and around the hospital and the football stadium, and there were so many prisoners there, so many hostages, that in the end they gave up the hostages and we allowed them to leave. About a year later, the final battle of Baghouz ended with tens of thousands of Islamic State prisoners taken. And it was very much that sort of mission accomplished moment, the George Bush sort of after the Iraq war moment, where the West sort of said, we've defeated the Islamic State. Let's start focusing on other issues. And then obviously with the rise with COVID and everything else, I think we've just been distracted. And I think we should come back to this. Now that Assad is out of the equation, the HTS has done that for us. I think there is this golden opportunity to look at our partners on the ground, look at the people in the region that are secular, democratic, progressive, the good guys on the ground that we can 100% put our heart and soul behind, and then back them. Get these prisoners through a judicial process, get Syria onto the path to peace and political and security stability.
Mesa, good to talk to you again. Thank you very much. That's Mesa Gifford, the human rights activist.